one happenstance. So, oh, this person is dolichocephalic, therefore they're black. I would never make that argument.
Without hesitation, the hypocrite certainly advocates for that argument here. Take a listen.
Only Africans exhibit dolichocephaly.
Of course, this assertion is entirely false and unsupported by any scientific evidence. Notably, he fails to provide a single peer-reviewed study to substantiate his claim. In fact, the very source he cites undermines his argument. Who relies on a study that literally shows images of East Indian skulls with dolichocephaly just to argue that only Africans exhibit dolichocephaly? Absolutely laughable. No one can take this fraud seriously. When scrutinized, every one of his assertions collapses to dust.
Wilkinson, okay, who's an anthropologist, she does a lot of the reconstructions. I think her reconstructions are awful. She said quite openly that trait is something that we see in ancient Egyptians and Black Africans. That's were her exact words. We see this trait in ancient Egyptians and Black Africans. That's how they estimated that Arsinoe might be mixed, because she was exhibiting that very trait, the trait that we're talking about. So she used it quite conclusively to say this person's probably Black.
And so a pathological liar opens its mouth. 1 minute one lie, the next minute another. The double standards, the inconsistencies, the deceit. Caroline Wilkinson made no such statement. Andy disgraced himself. He deliberately misrepresented Caroline Wilkinson and got caught doing so. He cut her statement in mid-sentence to change its meaning, an act that totally undermines his credibility, as if he had any at all. And did you catch that little act of deceit? First, he claimed the individual was mixed, and now suddenly the person is Black. He can't even keep his own narrative consistent. That slip says more than he realises. The so-called skull of Arsinoe, which, as it turned out, actually belonged to a young European boy from Italy. That's right, a European boy who had a dolichocephalic skull, to be precise. But you see, in Andy's twisted world of delusion, only sub-Saharans can express dolichocephaly. This says everything about his approach. He'll say anything, twist any piece of evidence, and lie outright if it helps him cope with facts. Remember this? This is where Andy shows his true racist colours. He deliberately deleted the most important and profound portion of Wilkinson's statement because, after all, according to the bullshit artist, only Black Africans can express dolichocephaly. Let's observe.
From the forehead to the back of the skull is long in relation to the overall height of the cranium, and that's something that you see quite frequently in certain populations, one of which is ancient Egyptians. Another would be Black African groups, well, also certain populations, one of which is ancient Egyptians. Another would be Black African groups.
Ancient Egyptians, Black African groups.
Now here is the full context of what Caroline Wilkinson says in regard to the skull. Pay close attention, this includes the portion that Andy deliberately edited out.
But some scholars now believe Cleopatra and her siblings had African blood. Could the answer be in this skull?
The distance from the forehead to the back of the skull is long in relation to the overall height of the cranium. And that's something that you see quite frequently in certain populations, one of which is ancient Egyptians. Another would be Black African groups, will also show that characteristic. This one certainly looks more white European. This one certainly looks more white European.
The key observation is that the skull showed distinctly white European characteristics. Because that fact contradicts Andy's claim that only Blacks are dolichocephalic and therefore ancient Egyptians must have been Black, he conveniently edited out Wilkinson's statement. He removed it precisely because it destroys his entire argument. This single detail alone completely undermines his idea that dolichocephaly is an exclusively Black trait. The skull itself clearly demonstrates otherwise. Even worse, he deceived his audience claiming this skull as proof that ancient Egyptians were Black simply because it was dolichocephalic, while completely ignoring and omitting the fact that the skull was white European. So he ended up treating a European skull as if it were an Egyptian one. Oh, the irony. To be fair, Caucasoids share certain cranial and dental similarities. However, you would expect Andy to at least have the capacity to distinguish a Negroid skull from a Caucasoid one. Apparently he can't. His deer in the headlights confusion says it all. See the disconnect? Why would Andy edit out an important and revealing remark from Caroline Wilkinson? The motivation is oh so exposing and perfectly consistent with the kind of selective, deceptive behaviour he, and by extension Afrocentrism, relies upon. And if that wasn't devastating enough, an early 2025 study on the exact same skull made the situation even worse for his narrative. Just look at what one of the study's authors had to say.
It's like Fifth Avenue of New York, right? And there's a super building that remains the Pharaohs of Alexandria, like an Egyptian building. And what we found was an 11 to 14-year-old guy who had really severe problems in his development. What the geneticists then could find out with the genes that we have is that he was most likely from Italy or Sardinia. So it's not unusual to find a Roman. It's a Roman boy, basically, that was in Ephesus 2000 years ago. But the surprising thing is, why was this guy buried in such a prestigious building?
Gerhard Weber, one of the authors on the study, recently published a paper in regard to the skull. He explains it was a young Italian boy, but Andy is desperate to turn white Europeans into either ancient Egyptians or sub-Saharan black folk. He couldn't be honest with his audience, but that doesn't matter to him or them. They're too willing, too eager to accept whatever narrative he stuffs down their throats, as long as it confirms their biases. Meanwhile, he profits from their trust, turning lies into a business model.
Urat man who they just pulled up is dolichocephalic. Ramesses is dolichocephalic. Menreptah, all of the New Kingdom lineage are dolichocephalic. So no, the point I'm trying.
Some are, some aren't, so that's a lie. They are orthognathic, have straight hair, and carry Eurasian haplogroups. This is indisputable. Akhenaten and Tutankhamun are brachycephalic. The point stands, dolichocephaly is not race-specific, and yet this one trait obsessed fool talks as if it is. That's why he fixates on the back of the skull as a distraction rather than the front of the face where the actual ancestry informative features are. And if he truly believed the nonsense he pushes, then why does this hypocrite culture jack civilizations produced by brachycephalic populations as well? We've had this discussion before, and he was exposed repeatedly. Akhenaten and Tutankhamun are classified as brachycephalic. The only figure in their lineage that expresses dolichocephaly is the beak-nosed, wavy-haired Yuya coming in with a cranial index of 70.3. None of the other members in Tutankhamun lineage show this trait. There isn't a modern scientific percentage for how many Eurasians or sub-Saharans are brachycephalic, dolichocephalic, or in between, since anthropology does not classify cranial index by race. The old cephalic index system, dividing skulls into dolichocephalic, mesocephalic and brachycephalic, was dropped decades ago once genetics showed that cranial index doesn't define ancestry or race here. A dolichocephalic European juxtaposed with the brachycephalic Tutankhamun and Akhenaten. Andy's narrative turned upside down and inside out.
Scanning the pharaohs. Sorry, I can't find it. Here it is. Scanning the pharaohs, and I can tell you a vast majority of the New Kingdom lineage have been scanned, and their cephalic indices has been taken, and the rates that you see in Dart's study are consistent.
Notice he champions this book while hiding behind it. Scanning the Pharaohs, unfortunately for Andy, I also own a copy. On page 94, it explicitly states that Tutankhamun has a brachycephalic skull, the cranial index being 84. So why didn't he show that to his audience? Because it destroys the narrative he's trying to push. He wants people to believe Tutankhamun was dolichocephalic, even though the experts who examined and measured the skull say otherwise. Akhenaten and Tutankhamun both are brachycephalic. However, that didn't stop Andy from lying. Contrary to all evidence and contrary to the experts who handled and measured the skulls, expert anthropologists classified the skull of Tutankhamun as Caucasoid North African and genetically belonging to R1b and K1a. What authority does this swivel chair fraud have that could possibly overturn experts? None. He lives in a world of lies and denials. It is impossible for Afrocentrics to acknowledge Europeans and Caucasoids, who in general can and do exhibit the dolichocephalic trait. The racism of Andy's Afrocentrism simply won't acknowledge it. Andy's mistake is in relying on a single trait while ignoring the full range of cranial characteristics that must be considered in proper analysis. This is precisely why his argument fails and why he can't be bothered to present a single study that agrees with his motives. It's because no such study exists. Here, a European and North African Berber, both expressing dolichocephaly, and a brachycephalic Italian, all of them Caucasoids and all representative of the normal cranial variation within Caucasoid populations.
There are features to Takabuti's skull that give ambiguous determination of ancestry. She's got a very long distance from the front of the skull to the back of the skull, which is something that is quite common in ancient Egyptians. But she also has what's called an occipital bulge, which is a bulge on the back of the skull that's more common in white European ancestry.
Caroline Wilkinson's analysis revealed that Takabuti, the 25th dynasty Egyptian mummy, expressed a dolichocephalic skull and showed genetic markers of European ancestry again. This directly undermines Andy's one trait argument in determining race. Focusing on a single feature while ignoring the full range of cranial characteristics and genetic data is precisely why his argument falls on its face. An occipital bulge, also referred to as occipital projection or occiput prominence, increases the back to front length of the skull, which can accentuate or contribute to a dolichocephalic appearance.
What can we say about the colour? Because on the mummy it looks as if it's blonde, almost a red-headed blonde.
Yes, fortunately, when Takabuti was unwrapped, a lock of her hair was kept separate. So this hair actually looks a darker brown or auburn colour. She wouldn't have been blonde or red.
That's a shame, really. But
Yeah.
what could you say about her ethnic background? Is there anything you can say about that from the hair?
Yes, we cross-section the hair, and there are three types. There's Mongoloid, Caucasian and Negroid. This is all determined by the shape the cross-section makes. And Takabuti was more Caucasian.
Right, yes.
Yeah.
Caucasian. You hear that, Andy? Caucasian. Not Negroid, not Sub-Saharan, not black, not nappy-haired. Takabuti was Caucasian, just like Tutankhamun. What in the world happened to your so-called Black Egypt? It never existed. Takabuti lived during the era of the illegitimate 25th Kushite dynasty, an outsider dynasty that briefly seized power and was not a reflection of the ancestral Egyptian population. If ancient Egyptians were so-called typical Sub-Saharans, then answer this simple question. Which Sub-Saharan population naturally displays the straight or wavy hair textures shown in countless Egyptian mummy samples? And while you're at it, which Sub-Saharan group carries European or Eurasian-associated mitochondrial haplogroups like H, HV, U, T, J, K or I, each of which is documented in ancient Egyptians across multiple dynasties? Andy can't point to any because his assertions don't reflect the genetic or physical reality demonstrated by actual evidence.